it's not here. I think it's fine. Okay, so basically we are going to try and finish this off today. We were around the 100th page, if I remember correctly. There's one last funny enough story. Sorry, I don't see the screen here again for some reason, but I'll make do with whatever is projected there. Okay, so I think we are on this page, and let's continue with that. I'm sorry if I look too much to the screen because that's where I'm seeing this text. I'm not able to see it on my screen here. Anyway, right. So we come back in a way to, some sort of, again, I mean, what we see a lot in the rest of this novel, as we will read today, is a reflection on time, a reflection of time that wasn't that strong. This idea of time wasn't that strong in the earlier sections. And again, I'm just summarizing the main point here. We can see some examples, but because we'll go a little bit faster today, I'm hoping I may not be always able to substantiate with the examples, but you can find them in the text. So there is a certain notion of time where we, think of time in a sort of chronological way. Okay, the screen is being shared, so you won't be able to see if I draw anything, no problem. So usually we see time in a sort of horizontal way, right? When we see time chronologically, we see it like a line. And that line, we usually don't think of it in terms of verticality. We think of it in a sort of horizontal way, that it's one line like this. But what if time is vertical? It could still be linear, right? A vertical sort of vision of time could still be linear, but it's almost like time as little things, maybe snowfall or something dropping, as it were. It's like a vertical line rather than a horizontal line. So we have this idea of time that doesn't pass. As the Unnamable ruminates and contemplates this question of time, the observation that strikes us the most here is this idea of a vertical time, a time that falls and heaps up around the Unnamable. It doesn't pass. It doesn't go. So there's no movement in this time. What we have is a kind of heaping. So that heaping is signaled by the verticality that I'm talking about. The verticality of time is a heaping of time. Time heaped up around you, time that doesn't move. So there is no passage of time, no horizontal passage of time, but a vertical heaping up of time. Let's remember that point because we see that quite a bit, and the question of time keeps coming back. Some of the other things that we've been talking about recurrently, this pedagogic idea of torture, master, slave, the sort of dialectic with three figures, primarily Mahud and Worm, but initially in the first part of the book, there was Basil. Towards the end of this book, these characters kind of disappear. We don't see, this is basically the last of what we see, mostly, of characters like Mahud. And again, there's also this confusion, as I was saying, who's in whose story? So who is functioning in whose story? Are these stories by Basil and Mahud where the Unnamable is sort of almost propped in as a little device? Or are these the Unnamable story where these figures, the master figures, are propped in? There's again at least an indication in this latter half of the book in the last 30 pages or so that we could also invert the scenario and think of the slave imagining the master rather than the master putting the slave into these stories. So there are these power inversions that happen. It's not a one-sided, power dynamic. It's reciprocal, let's say, and it's reversible. It's not irreversible. The power dynamic is not irreversible, but reversible. So these are a couple of observations I wanted to start with. Let's try and see what we can read. Definitely that little story at the end, but okay, we did talk about this a little bit, that, mechanical. Affect is mechanical. Whatever emotion you have here, they don't necessarily mean that the Unnamable is really sad or drooping. It's all mechanical. He's bathed in tears, as we say, as the Unnamable has said. there are various references to what the unnamable could be. It could be an animal. There are references to protozoa. There are references to cell. It could be a cell. You know, it could also be, a particular organ. Something that we see a lot throughout this text is this idea of not a body, but disjointed organs. Sometimes it's the ear. Sometimes it's the eye. Sometimes it's, the sexual organ that is made fun of primarily. But anyway, this idea of a fragmented body is interesting. A fragmented body, which is all about the different organs, but they don't make a body together. All the organs have to build a body together. That body building in a different sense, not the kind of body building that maybe Hrithik Roshan would do, but this kind of body building doesn't quite happen here. Doesn't happen in this case. What we have are these scattered organs, as it were. So a fragmented body, scattered organs, and this constant emphasis on the unnamable not being human or barely human, if at all. It's also at a certain point said that, the unnamable, as I said, it could be one, cell. It could just be one cell, not necessarily a multicellular organism like a human being or human subject. So there are these constant sort of questionings of the human subject, so to speak. Again, and these kind of typical sort of Irish bits are there throughout. The one would not care to have it on one's conscience. To have it on one's stomach is enough. So stomach is more important than conscience. There's a line in another Beckett story that goes, "What could I tell you about human destiny? I could tell you more about radishes." It's a bit like that. You can't always talk about serious things. There has to be some levity involved. Anyway, remember we were talking about that idea of speech always requiring an other function and God being an absolute representative of this other function. God is like the extreme other. You don't see, you don't hear. But if you want to believe, you believe in God, right? So at one level, God is like a condition of speech. And again, when I'm talking about the entity of God, I'm not necessarily thinking in religious terms. Conceptually, if you think of God as a concept, that is one of the requirements for any kind of speech, because a speech always addresses somebody. And if it doesn't address anybody, it could address God. For a believer, at least, all speech would address God. For a non-believer, at least there is a logical possibility that someone else is hearing, even though you think no one else is hearing. Like I hope no one outside this room is hearing. But someone might. I may not know. So anyway, are we alone? Are we together? This question will again come back. Is there a whole horde of people alongside the unnamable, or is he alone in the dark? So this particular question will come back again towards the end of the book, as we shall see, if we get the time, that is. Right. So again, I mean, is there a spectator? Is there anyone watching him? This problem of surveillance is again an important theme in the book, as we have been talking about. But it also shifts from a sort of an optic surveillance to a more auditory kind of surveillance, as I was saying last time. That surveillance may not always be just at the level of sight. It could also be at the level of sound. There's some very interesting literature that has emerged in recent times about politics of sounds, and primarily along sort of Foucaultian lines. Interesting. Politics of sound and this of sound. Okay. Right. So this constant, and this is another thing we've been talking about, right? This idea that fiction is a pack of lies. Because again, fiction, the word fiction itself doesn't only refer to literature, it could also refer to something that is a lie. Because this entire book is full of propositions which are made and then withdrawn, made and cancelled, made and cancelled. That's the function of contradiction. If you say I'm speaking the truth, and if your next sentence is I'm lying, then you don't know what you're talking about. Is it a truth or a lie, right? And the famous sort of liar's paradox is, there's that idea that everything is a lie. So if you say everything is a lie, the statement everything is a lie could also be a lie. Any absolute statement often gets into that logical problem that if I say everything is a lie, maybe I'm lying too, right? Because everything is a lie. So anyway, there's this idea of the lie. We've been told a lot of lies. We've been told a lot of lies. Who he, the master, by whom no one knows, the everlasting third party. That everlasting third party is God. That's why I say God is the extreme other, the other of the other, so to speak. If there is a sort of other of the other, that's the God. And that's very Hegelian again in that framework, because there's a master and a slave, but there's always a sort of everlasting third party, which for Hegel, because he was not a God believer, is death. Death is that everlasting third party for Hegel. Anyway, we mentioned this earlier. There are these references, odd but nevertheless significant references to the war. Like this one is perhaps one of the most direct references to the war. There's someone talking, which is the war. Okay. Can you please mute yourself? I think it's Arindam. Arindam, please mute yourself. Thank you. Right. And then you could have the war that is going on. Okay. So, right. And upon us all the silence will fall again and settle like a dust of sand on the arena after the massacres. I'm not sure if you're able to see this. Am I able to move the mouse across this? No. Okay. Our privileges are severely limited, like the Unnamable. We often find ourselves in this position where we don't know, what to do with the machine. It's like that. Anyway, so but if you can see, it's right in the middle of the page, which is projected like dust of sand on the arena after the massacres. This is a clear reference, right, to a kind of a political violence. And as you know, this idea of an arena where there'll be spectators to watch massacres, this has been a sort of political ritual in many countries, even in more recent times. This was a thing even in the 70s and 80s in Iran, for example, right? This practice of people watching political massacres from an arena, as it were, looking from all the different sides. And the famous idea, of course, comes from French Revolution, which I think Beckett is kind of partially gesturing towards. The French Revolution had these arenas that were called, arenas of massacre. But let's move on. There are references like this to a very specific kind of political violence, which goes back to that idea of surveillance, the Unnamable being surveyed, and all of that. Okay, wonderful. Now I can't seem to use the arrows either. You might have to go once again. I'm sorry. It's weird that this thing keeps happening. I'm sorry, we have to take a little bit of a pause because I'm not able to navigate anything in the screen here. Okay. But let's continue with the discussion a little bit forward. Give you a glimpse of the story that I don't know whether you've read, but there's a very peculiar story towards the end of the book, and that's what we would perhaps concentrate on today. So there's a story of war. It's directly a story about the war or from the war. So we have a soldier who comes back after being assumed to be dead. In the meantime, the wife has married or remarried. The soldier, and it's a completely laughable story, as you would soon see. So the soldier, while coming back in the train, becomes so happy that he would finally see his wife after all these years that he has a heart attack and dies. So he dies of happiness in the train, right? The wife has gone to the station to receive the soldier. In the meantime, the second husband, poor guy, hangs himself. Why? Because of sadness. So there are two deaths. One caused by happiness. एक बार आइए तो कुछ नेविगेट नहीं कर सकते हैं, क्या हो रहा है देखिए तो एक प्रॉब्लम है कि यहाँ पर ये दिख नहीं रहा है, ठीक है, और एक प्रॉब्लम है कि नेविगेट नहीं कर पा रहे. यहाँ पर इसको दिखा सकते हैं, मुझे हेल्पफुल होगा अगर ये हो सके. कौन सी ये शॉर्टकट क्या है इसका? विंडो पीछे फिर से एक बार स्क्रीन शेयर कर देना. अच्छा ठीक है, अब स्क्रीन शेयर करने से यहाँ पर भी दिखेगा ना. अच्छा एक बार देखिए आप, वो सारा सेम है. अच्छा ठीक है, शेयर स्क्रीन करने से ये वाला ही करें. अच्छा अभी यहाँ पर भी दिख रहा है. ठीक है, थैंक यू. हाँ ओके परफेक्ट. But let's continue with that story a little bit before we come back to the text where we left it off. So there are two deaths in this story. One is that the soldier who is coming back after he was assumed to be dead dies of happiness in the train. The second death is, of course, a death caused by sadness, that my wife will now go back to her first husband, right? So he hangs himself. And then we don't know who this, whether it's the mother of this second husband or the mother-in-law, but one of the two. Uh, she apparently discovers the second husband hanging, okay, in the house. And then this entire story, by the way, is told in half a page. You can understand it's like told like an abstract or a little synopsis. We'll come to that point. But so the story is not told with any veneer, with any detailing and so on. It's just very cutthroat, and it's a very staccato kind of style that is used. We'll see that. But the interesting point and the bizarre point the narrative sort of develops from this is who bolted the door. So apparently, after the second husband was found hanging, the door was bolted when the wife came back with the news that the first husband has also died. Okay. So when she comes back to the house, she finds the door bolted. And then the narrative or the narrator, whoever is narrating, I'm saying whoever is narrating because we don't know whether these stories are actually narrated by the Unnamable. There's always that ambiguity that they could be narrated by his masters to teach him something. Apparently, this story is used to teach the function of emotion. That's what it is saying. That the story is used to teach him the function of love, the emotion of love, right? Very interesting. Martha Nussbaum actually has written at length about this part of the book in her famous book on politics of emotions, where she talks about this particular part of the Unnamable and this sort of pedagogic function of the story as a sort of lesson on love. Anyway, who bolted the door becomes the question. So is it the mother-in-law or the mother of this second husband, the second dead husband? Because it's clearly not the wife. The wife didn't bolt the door from outside. Why would she do that? She was leaving a person who was alive at that point, right? So the door would be bolted from the inside, not from the outside. So who bolted the door becomes this classic Sherlock Holmes-like question, right? And but I would like to draw your attention to the fact that that's again a question of realism, right? I mean, usually, if you think about it, what is realism in a realistic story? We always think about the whole idea of make believe. Is it real? Is it looking real? Is it sounding real? That's what the directors would often say in a film, in a realistic film. Or you didn't say it the right way, or you just overdid it. You did it in a sort of Bollywoodish way. I mean, you have to be sort of a little bit understated, maybe, right? So this question of detailing. Is it make believe? Who bolted the door is not a question that you would usually ask in a Beckettian kind of narrative. It's a question that you would ask perhaps in a Dickensian narrative. Because it's an important question, right? I mean, who bolted the door? Was it the mother-in-law? Is the man before committing suicide cannot have bolted the door from outside, right? So that question is a question of realism because it's a question about believability, to add credence to the story, to add credibility to the story, right? And that question is focalized by the narrative. And then at the end of the book, the way it ends, it doesn't end, it kind of collapses. We come back to this image of the door. So again, we come back to the door, but we are not sure whether this is an actual door, the door that was mentioned in that little story, or is it a kind of metaphorical door? Because this seems to be the door to the Unnamable's own story, finally. Because as you know, I mean, as we have been discussing, this entire book is about the Unnamable failing at self-expression. He's constantly put into others' stories by others. He's not able to tell his own story. He's not able to narrate himself. If he could narrate himself, that would be the end of this apparently endless speech, right? That's what, from the very beginning, the book has concentrated on. So it ends with that door, which is perhaps an opening into that final silence, that silence that goes beyond language, the silence beyond speech, the silence that doesn't mean anything. It's not a pregnant silence. It's not a pause, or it's not a silence which would be broken ever. So the book ends with that image of the door, But of course, as you can understand from what I'm saying, it's a metaphorical door. It's not a literal door. But we move from the literal door and the question about the literal door in that little story, who bolted the door, to that metaphorical door, which is a door upon silence, a door that you have to open and get into the silence. And it seems like that's what the Unnamable is finally able to do. So it ends in a certain way with a sort of self-identification, which was sought throughout. And you would see this word seeking, which was not used before this point at all, becomes extremely recurrent in the last 20, 30 pages. The word seeking, some sort of a seeking is going on in the process. So I'll come to that story soon, but I was just filling out the time, letting it heap and not pass, perhaps. But anyway, this idea of suffering, as we have been talking about, just to jog your memories, that, does he suffer? The masters want to make him suffer, want to feel, want to tell that he's suffering. But if he doesn't feel a suffering, is it at all suffering? And that denunciation of suffering takes away from the whole religious, setup that the story or the novel has made. So there's a sort of self-critical take on that, the idea of the religious metaphors that are being used constantly, because they're always being used. Even at the end, the term confession is used. So it's there throughout. Again, this problem of self-identification, we've been talking about this throughout again. I assure you, look at this photograph. What? You see nothing. True for you. No matter here. Look at this death's head. The death's head is an expression. It's a Latinate expression that is translated here. Caput mortuum is the expression in original. You'll see, you'll be all right. It won't last long. Here, look, here's the record. Insults to policemen. So this is some sort of a record. It seems like they're, coming up with a set of records. What has the Unnamable done? Things like insults to policemen. So it goes back to that episode, if you remember, that I mentioned in Molloy, where, he was asked for some identity papers and he showed his toilet papers, and that too soiled toilet papers, right? How soiled? Let's not get into that. Right. So again, I mean, insults to policemen, indecent exposure, sins against Holy Ghost, contempt of court, impertinence to superiors, impudence to inferiors, deviations from reason, without battery. Look, no battery, it's nothing. You'll be all right. You'll see. So these are all the accusations that are made against him, And it reminds you of that famous opening sentence of The Trial, where, Kafka says, there was some sort of a rumor somebody started against Joseph K. And that was the beginning of the problem, right? Now, Agamben and others have argued that this rumor is not set forth by some person. Language itself starts a rumor against Joseph K. So Agamben and many others, not just Agamben, Derrida also famously makes this point, that Trial is about linguistic trial. The novel Trial by Kafka is about linguistic trial, how language puts you on trial, right? You're on trial at the court of language, as it were. And that thing is there. Of course, there's a linguistic torture that is pointed to throughout this book. So it's very much there in the Unnamable as well. Beckett loved Kafka, clearly. He, in fact, learned German to read Kafka in the original. So, yeah. So how to vanish, how to disappear. This is something, again, we've been looking at from the very beginning. I'm just going to skip a little bit so that we are able to. Yeah, this is, by the way, another subject position. As I was saying, is it a protozoa? Is it a cell? It's also perhaps a sperm. The Unnamable at one point considers itself to be nothing more than a sperm. But the idea of the sperm is important because it has some generative possibility. Of course, it's minuscule, it's minimal, that part is important, but then it's also generative. Something might come out of the sperm. I'm not going to go into the image of the drying sperm, which is, of course, completely bizarre. Charnel House of Renegades. That's a very interesting expression. I just wanted to isolate that expression because that's something that we see always in Beckett. As I was saying, if you remember, the figure of the tramp is very important in Beckett because the figure of the tramp is precisely a renegade. Who is a renegade? In sort of classic Marxist language, someone who's declassed. someone who chooses not to belong to his class. Of course, I mean, you are born into a certain class caste structure, but if you choose not to belong to that, not in a negative way though, in a positive sense. Anyway, I mean, let's not dwell too much on it, but it's important because that's what this book is all about. These voices without bodies, these barely human or non-human entities, linguistic entities that never quite become human, a charnel house of renegades. Of course, this hesitation whether the body can move at all, whether the unnamable has ever been able to go anywhere, or has it always been stuck to that same place? You know, this is again something we have seen from the very beginning. It doesn't quite know. It's a bit of both, as it were. There's a plethora of I's, I as in the first person pronoun. But again, we have to again take that with a pinch of salt, because each time the I is uttered, it is uttered with a certain sense of unbelieving, you know, to use that expression from the very beginning. I say I, unbelieving. Not that these I's are owned up. What time of the day it is, nobody knows. And then this idea, as I was saying, you know, this idea of a sort of time that heaps rather than a time that passes. It goes on like that. The sort of comedy around academics is of course there throughout. If you can see this, for example, business trips, pleasure trips, research expeditions, sabbatical leaves, clearly making fun of the professor, jaunts and rambles, honeymoons at home and abroad, and long, sad, solitary tramps in the rain. So these are again sort of a cataloging of all the experiences he has had. But again, the problem remains, are they his experience or are they someone else's? He doesn't quite know. This ambiguity is something that Beckett comes back to in a much later text, a shorter text, Company, where again, we don't know whose memories these are. I mean, imagine the situation where you are alone and thinking about your past, and you don't quite know whether the memories that are coming back to your head are yours or someone else's. So again, it's the same problem, essentially. That's Company, anyway. Let's come back. The problem of not being able to finish talking unceasingly, seeking, that word, as I said, which appears again and again throughout this part, seeking incessantly and then seeking indefatigably, and goes on. The God problem, we've talked about it, so I'm not going to go deeper into that. We've talked about fear of sounds as well as fear of lights. Both are there, right? I mean, the lights are a bit of torture, and lights were often used in torture mechanisms. If you think about it, there are some very common ways of torturing people. One is to constantly, flash a light on their eyes and keep sort of flashing it. So those methods are in use here. There are also moments when the unnamable thinks of itself, and again, let's call it itself, as a sort of liquid phenomenon, not as solid, but as a liquid phenomenon. In fact, there's this very peculiar image of pots, one pot being filled, the other pot gets emptied. As the first pot is filled, the second pot gets emptied, and then the image is revised into a series of pots where after one is filled, you fill the next one, and it goes on like that. And as if the unnamable is that liquid that is being poured into these pots. So there's this image of liquefaction. It goes back to that image of liquefied brain. Tears are liquefied brain, as we saw in the first half of the text. Right. So again, this is another place where we have that idea of time heaping up around 113-14. Just come straight to the story, but I'm just looking if there's anything more here that I wanted to at least mention. Again, those disdainful references to all the other characters, Murphy, Watt, Malone, but they're all done. There's not much they can do anyway. There's an odd reference to Shelley, this page, but again, I'm making fun of romantic literature more than anything else. because there's very little nature in what is described here. The setting is hardly something that would make you feel like you're in nature. And again, there's this attempt to maybe tell another tale, another story. Should we tell another story? Is there room for another story, another of Mahmood's old tales? Yeah. Again, that idea of time, as I was saying, time just falls off. And as a result, you can't even know how old the Unnamable is. I'm 3 seconds old. Oh, not every day of the week. I've been away, done something, been in a hole. Because every second is the birth of a new subject. And again, this is a certain idea where in philosophy, sometimes it's called this polysubjectivism, where you don't think of yourself as one self. You are like a series of selves, like a series of mirror reflections. So nobody is one. Anyway, you are a multitude. Even without revolution, you are a multitude. You're a multitude in yourself, let's say. Okay. Let's just continue. Again, the desire for silence, we've covered these things. There are repetitions, of course. I'm not going to go into each of these iterations unless there's something else to talk about here. A description, the problem of describing the place, not knowing where the Unnamable is. Again, we've seen this from the very beginning, trying to measure the place. Is it circular? Is it a square? There's a beautiful part, which I don't know, let's see if we can find it. Because that's the part where it talks about two kinds of, actually had to go back. Anyway, I'm neither, so the Unnamable is neither the inside nor the outside. This is the point. I feel an outside and an inside and me in the middle. Perhaps that's what I am, the thing that divides the world in two. On the one side, the outside, on the other, the inside, that can be as thin as foil. I'm neither one side nor the other. I'm in the middle. I'm the partition. I have two surfaces and no thickness. Perhaps that's what I feel. Myself vibrating. I'm the tympanum. Tympanum is a part of the ear. Okay? This is on page 108. So again, tympanum goes back to that idea of the auditory, as I was saying. But this idea that the Unnamable is neither a mind nor a world. It's the partition between the mind and the world. That's why it has two surfaces, but no thickness. A partition often, seems to have very little thickness. Just a line that divides two zones that can partake of two surfaces. It's a geometrically complicated idea. But anyway, it can partake of both the surfaces of the two zones, but it doesn't have a thickness of its own. That's what the Unnamable feels like. Let's go back to where we were. Let me see if there's. Yeah, this is the problem of description, as I was saying here. Again, I mean, you can see here how many eyes are there in these passages. Again, but all the repetitions of the eye actually connote or imply how difficult it is to identify with this I, to identify with this self. Let's come to the story now. Almost there. So again, gray, black, the differences of color. The word hypothesis, again, the way it is used throughout the book, especially this part, again, goes back to that idea of an academic comedy, as I was saying, the satire of academia. Hypothesis is what you do in a dissertation. And the word dissertation has also been used in this book to talk about this self-expression. Uh, right, here we have it now. Right, so this is where it starts, this story. Okay, again, see how innocuously it is narrated. This is on 128. They love each other, marry, in order to love each other better, more conveniently. He goes to the wars, he dies at the wars, she weeps with emotion at having loved him, at having lost him. Yep, marries again, in order to love again, more conveniently again. They love each other. You love as many times as necessary in order to be happy. He comes back, the other comes back from the wars. He didn't die at the wars after all. She goes to the station to meet him. He dies in the train of emotion at the thought of seeing her again, having her again. She weeps, weeps again with emotion again at having lost him again. Yep, goes back to the house. He's dead. The other is dead. The mother in law takes him down. He hanged himself with emotion at the thought of losing her. She weeps, weeps louder at having loved him, at having lost him. There's a story for you. That was to teach me the nature of emotion. That's called emotion. What emotion can do given favorable conditions, what love can do. Well, so that's emotion, that's love. And trains, the nature of trains, and the meaning of your back to the engine and guards, stations, platforms, wars, love, heartrending cries. That must be the mother-in-law. Her cries rend the heart as she takes down her son or her son-in-law. I don't know. Must be her son, since she cries, and the house door is bolted. When she got back from the station, she found the house door bolted. Who bolted it? He the better to hang himself? That can't be, right? Or the mother in law the better to take him down? Or to prevent her daughter in law from re entering the premises because she doesn't want her to see this awful scene? There's a story for you. It must be the daughter in law. It isn't the son in law and the daughter, it's the daughter in law and the son. How I reasoned, to be sure, this evening. It was to teach me how to reason. This is another important point. A narrative teaches the act of reasoning. A narrative teaches the act of rationalization. We often rationalize things through stories, right? Even if you think about it, I mean, in real life, sometimes if something weird has happened, and if you're not able to explain it, you will try and make it into a story and talk about it, maybe with a friend or with anybody, right? To try and make sense of it. So, first, this story is a lesson on love. Of course, a very satirical lesson on love. It's not a very romantic lesson on love, as you can see. It's also told in this very offhandish, innocuous manner. Even the characters are not given a name. So there's nothing realistic about this, even though it's a very cliched story. The story itself is very cliched, right? It's a very typical story. I mean, all of us, in fact, I'm sure, have heard these stories about soldiers assumed to be dead, their wives remarrying and then the soldier coming back. This is a typical, Bollywood, Hollywood potboiler, right? So there's nothing new in this. And again, the whole idea of storytelling itself is undermined by the cliched nature of the story. But the story is a lesson in emotions. It's an emotional training going on. It's a part of emotional education. It's also a lesson in rationality. So these are the two things, if you think about it, since 18th century, this is the typical idea that, passion and reason, emotion and reason, these are the two things that constitute the human subject. So any humanist education has to address these 2 points. How to make you into a better human being. We've really been made into better human beings, as we can see. But anyway, that's the claim, at least. Similarly, so that's again where the emotion question is dealt with, and also to make you into a more intelligent human being. That's where the rational question is dealt with. So after this, this is the question: who bolted the door? Which the narrator gets completely obsessed with. Who bolted the door, and that seems to be the entire question, the entire concern here. There's a reference here. There's another thing I wanted to mention briefly. There's a reference to Abderite. Abderite refers to the Greek. So there are 2 Greek philosophers whom Beckett always mentions and always kind of, some weird references. One is Democritus. So Abderite refers to Democritus. There's another one who is, of course, Heraclitus, right? So Heraclitus and Democritus, there's a very funny letter where Beckett was asked, is Waiting for Godot a comedy? Is it a tragedy? What do you think? And he was like, okay, so there are two famous philosophers who are associated with two emotions, right? In Greek philosophy, uh, generally, Heraclitus is the sad philosopher, always weeping. I mean, I'm sure all of you have heard about this. Heraclitus was behind this famous proverb that you can't bathe in the same water twice because the water flows in, right? So he's always, he's like a Keatsian guy. He's always sad about the flux of time, life, and all those things. So he's a sad guy, essentially, right? Democritus is a chirpy guy. He's always laughing around, right? So Democritus is laughing like you, and Heraclitus was like weeping like her. Now, let's say one of you is weeping, the other one is laughing. The question Beckett asked in that letter to this gentleman who asked whether it was a comedy or tragedy was that, okay, so Democritus is laughing as usual, and Heraclitus is, crying as usual. Now, is Heraclitus crying because Democritus is laughing, or is Democritus laughing because Heraclitus is crying? Which one is which, right? So you can't know that, right? In a weird way, this story is also a story that makes Democritus and Heraclitus, though he doesn't refer to Heraclitus here, it makes them, to use again that word that Beckett always uses, they're like a pseudo couple. The Democritus and Heraclitus are like a pseudo couple because together we have this gamut of emotions from sadness to laughter, right? But we don't know whether the laughter produces sadness or the sadness produces laughter. That's the idea of the tragicomic, where you don't know which part causes what. But there's a reference to the Abderite, which is very clear. So in the story, of course, there is a sort of Democritian angle because this soldier is so happy to meet his wife, right? He dies in the train. That's the Democritian part. It evokes laughter. But funnily, the Heraclitean part, this other guy who commits suicide, if you think of the two situations together, that's also funny, even though suicide is not funny. In the situation, if you think about it, this man, if he had waited for a few hours, let's say, he would have come to know that his competitor is dead, right? Of happiness. But he had to die of sadness. So that together makes it funny. The story becomes funny. Anyway, so we have that Democritus Heraclitus doubling or that pseudo coupling in the emotional sort of fabric of the story. We're almost at the end now. These are the last 2 or 3 pages. Again, this idea of the vomit, as I've been suggesting, this is like a word vomit, a linguistic vomit that we have been reading throughout. A rant, if you want to call it a rant these days, that's a more 21st century lingo for it, or it's a kind of a vomit. It's also interesting that the other word used here, again, a very clearly sexual word, is ejaculation. It could also be like a linguistic ejaculation, right? A linguistic masturbation. We are very fond of using the term intellectual masturbation in India. So you know what I'm talking about. This is a kind of linguistic masturbation, which is often what poor Shashi Tharoor gets accused of, okay. We're almost done. This is the last part where I just want to signal how the word door is used because we don't have the time. I have to use Control F that I never want to use, but I keep using. Wonderful. I don't want that. I want the next towards the end. Yeah. So this is the last part. Again, you see the religious words, right? Repent, punished. All these could have religious connotations. A victim. I mean, he has been basically posing like a victim throughout this book, right? I've only to listen. It will show me my hiding place, what it's like, where the door is. So this is the metaphorical door that I was talking about. If there is a door, okay? And whereabouts I am in it, and what lies between us now, how the land lies, what kind of country, whether it's sea, whether it's mountain, and the way to take so that I may go, make my escape, give myself up, come to the place where the axe falls. Very quickly, as I was saying, we might come back to this tomorrow if you want me to elaborate on this. So what you would see in these last 20, 30 pages that we read today is this reference to a place with 2 windows. One of the windows shows the earth, the other window shows the sea. In fact, in one of the earlier lectures on the Unnamable, if you remember, I was saying that he translated the text into English almost after 7 years. And the play that he was writing just before this was Endgame. Now, anyone who knows Endgame would know this is sort of a reference to Endgame, because the setting of Endgame is like a skull again, where there are two windows, two high windows. One of the windows opens out to the sea, the other opens out to the earth. And there's a sort of shelter, which is the setting on stage. So there's a reference to that. Plus, there's another section which I didn't get the time to read, but let me at least mention it. There's a very sort of longish section on theater here in this last part, where the Unnamable is talking about a performance where you go to a performance, you occupy your seats, you're sitting there, the performance never quite happens. And then you realize to make the audience wait for the performance was the performance. So there was no play. There was no play to be staged. You could do that here. Instead of having the play, we could just, have 200 people come, wait, cuss everyone, and then leave. I'm sure they would have. This is India. Come on. If you bring people into whatever an auditorium and never have a performance, gali denge. Definitely denge. Anyway, so there is that little section on the theater where the entire performance is waiting for a performance to come, which never quite happens, which is a bit like this book. You keep waiting for a story to come. All that you get is a completely broken story like the one we just read. Okay. So that theatrical metaphor is something I at least wanted to point to. You can find that quite easily in these last 30 pages. But this door, as I was saying, there's sea on the one hand, there's mountain. We don't know what lies outside this door. But this door is the door to silence, the door where finally, the Unnamable will get to be himself. Again, as you can see, this word door comes back. Perhaps that's a door. Find the door, open the door, drop into the silence, which is almost like a suicide, as it were. You're jumping from the door. You don't know what door it is. I mean, it could be the door that leads to a staircase, and you might fall all the way down. So there's a sort of a slightly suicidal element here with the jump, or this idea of the drop from the door. Just drop into the silence. But that silence anyway is the final silence after language. So you could possibly think of that as a kind of death. What is the final silence after all language is spent, all speech is spent? That's basically the silence of the corpse, the silence of a dead body, which cannot speak anymore. So there's that, and that's how it comes to an end. I'll just read the last bit because it's famous, I suppose. Okay, there's no other reason to read it. I know they're going to stop. I know that well. I can feel it. They're going to abandon me. It will be the silence for a moment, a good few moments, or it will be mine, the lasting one. That didn't last. So again, the lasting one, the very next sentence, not even a sentence, that didn't last. Contradictions keep going, right? That still lasts. Another contradiction. Lasting one, didn't last, still lasts. It will be I. You must go on. I can't go on. You must go on. I'll go on. You must say words as long as there are any, until they find me, until they say me. So here you can see how words speak the human subject in a very post-structuralist kind of a position to take. But words speak us as much as we speak words, right? So they refers to words. Words say me, quite literally, because words produce the I, the subject, right? Words say me. So the words have finally said the Unnamable. He's at the end of the speech. Strange pain, strange sin. You must go on. Perhaps it's done already. Perhaps they have said me already. Perhaps they have carried me to the threshold of my story. Again, the door before the door that opens on my story. That would surprise me if it opens. It will be I. It will be the silence where I am. I don't know. I'll never know. In the silence, you don't know. You must go on. I can't go on. I'll go on. Now, these last three injunctions, one thing to note here is that the sentence has become very unruly in the last part of the book. These are sometimes one-page sentences. It's huge. So these are just phrases strung together with no full stop. And it's interesting, the manuscript shows Beckett used his pen so heavily for the final full stop that it was like a blot. And many scholars have compared it to like a death sentence, where as you know, the custom is when there's a death sentence, you literally put an end to you literally put an end to the pen as well, because you know that the person is dying, and you've given a death sentence. The judge usually breaks the nib. Back in the day when there was a nib, what is a nib now? Some of you may not know that, but anyway. So this full stop is something that appears like a huge blot on the paper in the archival manuscript. Two quick things. These last three injunctions, as I said, they've been quoted, overquoted, misquoted. It's kind of almost an embarrassment to talk about these three injunctions for anyone who actually reads Beckett, because people who quote don't read Beckett. They just read this last, it's like an inspiring quote. Brainycode.com. It's that kind of reference, those kinds of references. But there are some interesting ones, like Salman Rushdie has cited this. Many people, I mean, it's a very common thing. It's cited by race theorists, to post-colonialists, almost everyone. Anyway, let's not go into that, but you know why? Because it's sort of an ethical imperative. A lot of people have considered this to be a sort of Beckettian version of the ethical imperative in Kant. You must go on, I can't go on, I'll go on. And if you go back, that's the idea of the palindrome we were talking about. There's a no, and the no gets transposed into an on, right? So I can't go on, that's a no. And then the no leads to an on, I will go on, I'll go on, right? You must go on, I can't go on, I'll go on. One archival detail about this is that this was only there in the English text. And in a much later French edition, in the 70s, I'm not exactly able to recall when, in the mid 70s, when the Unnamable was reprinted in a new edition, Beckett made a translation of this injunction and put it back into the French text. So just for any archival scholar, these details are interesting because there's sort of an injection back into the French text, as it were. It's not something that was there in the French text. And the word that he uses here in the French text, from what I remember, is continuer, not encore, which is another word he often uses for on. But as I say, there's a difference between the on of continuation and the on of repetition. Because the on of repetition, encore, is slightly different. You might be repeating the same thing. But when you say repeating, there's a break there. There are multiple iterations. When it's a continuation, it could be the same iteration. Right? But this idea that in the face of impossibility, you still have to go on. This idea is essentially what has stuck with a lot of people, has inspired a lot of people. So I don't want to entirely, take away from this, decontextualized brainycode.com kind of quotation, because it has kind of inspired people. All right, no problem at all. Though the prospects, if you read it in the text, are not that inspiring, as you have seen in the text. Anyway, so let's stop here. Tomorrow we will, just because I have another Viva to go to right now, so I can't take questions today, but the entire day tomorrow, if you have any questions, not just about this text, about anything else in the course, maybe I'll do a very quick wrap up to the course in the first 10 minutes, and then you can ask a few questions. Otherwise, we could have some food rather than having questions. But please try and come in person, those of you who are here. Okay, thank you very much.